The 38th floor of the Chen Digital Security headquarters hummed with a tension that had nothing to do with the servers cooling in the walls. Natalie Chen stood before $8 million of custom-engineered steel and quantum circuitry, watching five of the world's most expensive security specialists admit defeat with their silence. 3 hours they had worked, 3 hours of thermal imaging and algorithmic gymnastics in desperate calls to manufacturers in Switzerland, and the vault door remained sealed as tight as a tomb. Inside that tomb sat the encryption keys for a military satellite system worth $4.5 billion, and in exactly 2 hours and 47 minutes, a room full of Pentagon generals would be waiting for Natalie to hand them those keys in person. The irony burned like acid. Chen Digital Security had built its reputation on making the impenetrable accessible to the right people at the right time. Now Natalie's own vault had turned against her, and every failed attempt by her team of experts only proved what her competitors had whispered for years, that a 34-year-old woman, an immigrant daughter or not, Stanford degree or not, couldn't be trusted with the serious business of national defense. David Kim wiped sweat from his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning, his fingers trembling slightly as he disconnected another diagnostic cable. The equipment scattered across the marble floor, $2 million worth of specialized tools, looked less like precision instruments and more like the abandoned toys of frustrated children. He glanced at Natalie with the particular expression of a man who had spent a decade climbing to the position of director of cybersecurity, only to discover that expertise meant nothing in the face of genuine catastrophe. "We've exhausted all conventional methods," he said, and the words hung in the air like an epitaph. "The quantum encryption is locked in a cascade failure we've never encountered. Every attempt to bypass it triggers deeper security protocols." Dr. Raymond Foster, 55 years old and carrying credentials from MIT that usually opened any door, pulled off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the gesture of a man confronting the limits of his understanding. "The retinal scanners you installed 72 hours ago are incompatible with the original quantum core," he said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone explaining a terminal diagnosis. "They're sending authentication requests every 0.3 seconds, but the core processes on 1.2-second cycles. It's creating an authentication loop that's essentially weaponizing your own security against you." Natalie felt something cold slide down her spine, and for the first time in 12 years of running this company, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what failure would mean. Not just the contract, though losing $4.5 billion would gut her company and put 2,400 people out of work. Not just the years of research and development that would be handed to global tech, her primary competitor, on a silver platter, but the voices that would follow her for the rest of her career, the same voices that had followed her since she was the only woman in her Stanford engineering classes. "See, we told you. Girls can't handle the pressure. Should have stayed in business school where you belonged." Her father's voice, loudest of all, speaking Mandarin with that particular disappointed tone he had perfected over 34 years. "Nu hai zuo bu liao jega. Girls cannot do this kind of work." The click of expensive Italian leather on marble announced Omar al-Rashid's arrival before his voice did. He moved through the office with the unhurried confidence of a man whose Abu Dhabi Investment Authority had $800 million invested in Chen Digital Security, which meant he had every right to be unhurried and every reason to be concerned. At 35, Omar had built a reputation in the Gulf for identifying promising ventures early and extracting himself gracefully when they began to fail. "Asayda Tashin," he said, the formal Arabic greeting carrying layers of meaning that his English couldn't quite capture. "Perhaps we should consider postponing the ceremony. I have contacts with European specialists who could be here by tomorrow." Natalie turned to face him, and something in her expression must have communicated what words couldn't, because Omar's suggestion died in the air between them. She had not clawed her way out of her father's skepticism and her ex-husband's resentment and the condescension of 1,000 boardrooms to postpone anything for anyone. "We don't postpone," she said, and her voice carried the particular chill that had earned her the nickname Ice Queen in Silicon Valley circles. "We solve." But even as she said it, she could feel the cold mathematics of the situation calculating themselves in the back of her mind. 2 hours and 43 minutes. A drive to the Pentagon that would take at minimum 45 minutes, assuming traffic cooperated, which it never did. which left less than 2 hours to solve a problem that had defeated her entire security team, or watch everything she had built crumble into the kind of public failure that would vindicate every person who had ever doubted her. The next failed attempt, Dr. Foster said quietly, might trigger a permanent lockdown. The system would seal completely and destroy the encryption keys rather than risk compromise. We'd need industrial cutting equipment, which would take days, and even then we might damage the data beyond recovery. So don't fail, Natalie said, knowing even as the words left her mouth how hollow they sounded, how close they came to the kind of desperate command that marked the difference between a leader in control and a captain going down with her ship. 42 stories below, in the shadows of Manhattan's financial district, where the morning light hadn't yet penetrated, Jake Carson woke into the sound of his daughter's breathing and the particular cold that came from sleeping in a vehicle not designed for human habitation. The Ford Econoline van had been his home for 4 months now, and he had learned its rhythms the way a sailor learns the moods of his ship, where the cold seeped in through the rusted floor panels, which parking spots the police ignored, how to angle the vehicle so the morning sun would warm Emma's sleeping bag before she woke. Emma stirred in the back, 8 years old and small for her age, wrapped in an army surplus sleeping bag that Jake had liberated from a donation bin behind a church. She had her mother's features, which meant Jake couldn't look at her without feeling the ghost of Sarah's presence, without remembering the accident 18 months ago that had turned a drunk driver's moment of stupidity into a defining catastrophe that divided Jake's life into before and after. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, keeping his voice soft. The words emerged as small clouds in the December air. Time to get up. His morning routine had the efficiency of military training adapted to civilian poverty. Baby wipes for washing, pulled from a package he'd bought at a dollar store. Cold Pop-Tarts for breakfast, because cooking required resources he didn't have. Emma's clothes laid out in order, because an 8-year-old needed structure, even when structure was the one thing her life most conspicuously lacked. Emma sat up slowly, her breath visible, her eyes carrying the particular awareness of a child who understood more than adults wanted to believe. She looked at her shoes, at the cardboard he'd stuffed in yeast to cover the holes wearing through the soles, and something in her expression made Jake's chest tighten with a guilt that had become as familiar as breathing. "It's cold, Daddy," she said, and the simple observation carried no complaint, just statement of fact, which somehow made it worse. "I know, baby." He pulled out the jacket she'd been wearing since September, thin, synthetic material that might have been adequate for autumn, but was catastrophically insufficient for the New York winter that was settling in like an occupying army. "We'll get you a better coat soon, I promise." The promise tasted like ash. Jake had been making promises for 4 months, ever since the VA benefits had been tangled in bureaucratic knots and the apartment in Queens had been lost to an eviction notice, and he'd made the decision to live in the van rather than let Emma go into foster care. Every promise felt like another small betrayal of the life he'd planned, the life where his GI Bill would fund a mechanical engineering degree, and his combat experience would translate into civilian competence, and Emma would grow up with stability and warm coats, and a father who didn't keep his survival kit stashed under the driver's seat. Jake had served 4 years as a combat engineer in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2010 to 2014, and he had learned things about problem solving that no civilian engineering program could teach. How to defuse IEDs with inadequate equipment and incomplete information. How to repair vehicles in the field using materials that weren't in any technical manual. How to make decisions under pressure when the cost of failure was measured in human lives. But none of that seemed to matter to the HR algorithms that filtered his job applications into digital oblivion before human eyes ever saw them. And none of it helped him now as he watched his daughter eat cold Pop-Tarts in the back of a van. The morning reconnaissance was pure habit. Check the streets for police, watch for early shift workers who might ask questions, scan for opportunities that might present themselves to a man desperate enough to take risks and skilled enough to minimize them. The Chen Digital Security Building caught his attention not because of its size or prominence, but because of the construction markers still visible around the service entrance. New construction meant scrap metal in the waste bins, copper wire and aluminum sheeting that recyclers would buy for cash, And cash meant he could buy Emma a proper winter coat before the December cold turned genuinely dangerous. The plan formed with the same tactical clarity he'd once used to plan convoy routes through Kandahar province. Slip in during the shift change when security was distracted, access the service areas through the maintenance quarters, grab whatever metal was lying in the waste bins, and exit before anyone noticed. Not theft, not really, just salvage of materials that would otherwise go to the dump. Just the kind of gray area survival that separated homelessness from complete destitution. He left Emma in the van with strict instructions to lock the doors and not open them for anyone but him. And the look she gave him carried the weight of a child who had learned that her father's absences were necessary but never truly safe. "Love you, Daddy," she said, and Jake felt those words like a physical thing, like a hand reaching into his chest. "Love you more, sweetheart. Be back in 30 minutes. The service entrance yielded to his presence with the inevitability of a system designed to keep people out, but not designed well enough to keep out someone who actually understood systems. Jake had learned building security in the Army, had studied the patterns and blind spots that existed in every structure, regardless of how expensive its defenses. The camera positions, the shift change timing, the maintenance access points that architects included for practical purposes and security consultants forgot to adequately monitor. The ventilation shaft leading to the upper floors was barely large enough for his frame, and the climb required the kind of sustained physical effort that left him breathless and aware of how little he'd been eating. But it was familiar work, the tight spaces and improvised routes, and by the time he reached the 38th floor, his hands were moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 similar infiltrations in 100 different Iraqi buildings. The voices reached him before he saw anything, filtering through the thin metal of the maintenance panel in fragments of frustration and technical jargon. Male voices, mostly, with the particular edge that came from educated people confronting the limits of their education. And one female voice carrying an authority that suggested ownership, that suggested this was her disaster and her timeline and her consequences to face. Jake pressed his ear to the panel and caught pieces of the conversation, enough to understand that these people were locked out of something important, that expensive equipment wasn't working, that a deadline was approaching with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. His combat-trained mind filed the information automatically, sorted it, recognized patterns. The sensible thing would be to slip away, grab whatever scrap metal he could carry, and exit before anyone knew he'd been there. But sensible had not been working out particularly well for Jake Carson lately, and something about the desperate frustration in those voices resonated with his own desperation in a way he couldn't quite ignore. And there was something else, something familiar about the technical problem they were describing, the authentication loops and temporal mismatches that reminded him of a particular IED in Kandahar province in 2011, a device that had nearly killed his entire squad until Jake had figured out how to make its own security protocols work against it. He carefully removed the vent cover and lowered himself into what appeared to be an office designed by someone with unlimited resources and a taste for demonstrating that fact. Original artwork on walls that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Carpet thick enough to sink into. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that was less scenery and more statement of dominance. And in the center of it all, a massive steel vault surrounded by 5 men in expensive suits staring at diagnostic equipment with expressions that ranged from baffled to defeated. Jake stepped out from behind the enormous mahogany desk, and for a moment the room simply froze. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward him with the synchronized precision of people confronting something their brains couldn't immediately process. 5 security technicians in suits that probably cost $3,000 each, and 1 woman in a power suit that probably cost more. The woman, Natalie Chen had to be, this was clearly her office, looked at him with an expression that cycled through shock and fury and calculation in the space of a single breath. She was younger than Jake had expected, maybe his age, with the kind of severe beauty that came from bone structure and discipline rather than softness. Her black hair was pulled back in a way that suggested control, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that was actively evaluating him as a threat or opportunity or obstacle to be removed. Security breach, David Kim said, and his hand was already moving toward his phone. How did a... Wait, Omar al-Rashid interrupted, and something in his tone carried enough authority to freeze Kim's hand mid-reach. The man was Jake's age, maybe slightly older, dressed in the kind of suit that whispered old money and international finance. His accent carried the particular cadence of British education layered over Gulf Arabic, and his expression suggested curiosity rather than alarm. How did you get in here? Natalie Chen asked, and her voice was cold enough to frost glass but controlled enough that Jake knew she was thinking past the immediate situation to the implications it carried. Jake raised his hand slowly, the universal gesture of non-threat that he'd learned carried more weight than words. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I was looking for scrap metal in your waste bins, copper wire, aluminum sheeting, stuff you were throwing away anyway. The explanation hung in the air like something absurd, which it was. Here he stood in an office that probably cost more to furnish than most houses, surrounded by equipment worth millions, and his defense was that he'd been dumpster diving for recyclables. You broke into my building, Natalie said, and each word was precisely articulated, to look for garbage. Yes, ma'am, Jake said, and the old military courtesy slipped out automatically. I needed money for my daughter's winter coat. I wasn't going to steal anything valuable. Just scrap. He saw something flicker across her face at the mention of a daughter, some quick calculation or recognition, but it passed before he could read it clearly. She was about to speak again, probably to tell David Kim to call the police, when Jake's eyes caught on the vault door and the error codes cycling across its display panel. The patterns were wrong, not chaotic, but systematically wrong in a way that suggested the system was fighting itself. And suddenly he was back in Kandahar, staring at an IED with an electronic lock that was cycling through security protocols that conflicted with its own timing mechanisms, and understanding with sudden clarity that these expensive experts were solving the wrong problem. I can help with that, Jake heard himself say, and the words were out before his tactical mind could stop them. The room went very still in a different way. Natalie's expression shifted from fury to something more complex, and Omar leaned forward slightly with the posture of someone whose interest had been genuinely captured. Help with what? Natalie said, and her voice was carefully flat. Your vault, Jake said, nodding toward the massive steel door and its angry display panel. I know I shouldn't be here, and I'm sorry about that, but I couldn't help overhearing your problem, and I think I might know what's wrong. Dr. Foster made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Young man, this is a military-grade quantum encryption system worth $8 million. I somehow doubt that, he paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic word, that someone with your background would have relevant expertise. Jake felt his jaw tighten, felt the old familiar anger at being dismissed based on appearance, on assumptions, on the visible markers of poverty that had become his uniform. Combat engineer, he said, keeping his voice level. United States Army, 2010 to 2014. I specialized in IED disposal and field modifications of security systems. I've worked on electronic locks more sophisticated than that one, and I've done it under conditions where failure meant people died. David Kim was shaking his head before Jake finished speaking. Even if that's true, this isn't some roadside bomb. This is a Mosler double guard with quantum encryption overlays. You can't just... The new biometric scanners are sending authentication requests every 0.3 seconds. Jake interrupted, his eyes still on the vault's display panel. But your quantum core processes on 1.2-second cycles. The new system is trying to integrate with the old one, but they're running on different temporal frameworks. Every time you try to authenticate, the new system sends verification requests faster than the old system can process them. So the old system interprets it as a brute force attack and locks down harder. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. Dr. Foster's face had gone pale, and David Kim was staring at Jake as if he'd started speaking fluent Mandarin. Omar al-Rashid's expression had shifted into something that looked almost like amusement, and Natalie Chen was watching Jake with an intensity that made him uncomfortably aware of how he must look. Unshaven, clothes dirty from crawling through ventilation shafts, the visible markers of homelessness that no amount of competence could quite erase. That's, Dr. Foster said slowly, actually exactly correct. The temporal mismatch between authentication protocols would create precisely this kind of cascading failure. How could you possibly... Seen it before, Jake said. Kandahar 2011. Different equipment, same principle. When you have two systems trying to talk to each other on different timescales, they end up creating a feedback loop that makes everything worse. Natalie took a step forward, and Jake found himself meeting her eyes directly. They were dark and sharp and calculating, and he saw her running some kind of internal cost-benefit analysis in real time. Even if you understand the problem, she said, these systems can't be manually reset. The manufacturer's backdoor codes expired last month, and getting new ones would take... You don't need backdoor codes, Jake said. You need to think like the system. Every vault has emergency protocols built in by the designers. Liability protections they don't advertise because it would compromise security. If you can convince the system that maintaining security protocols would result in catastrophic data loss, it'll prioritize preservation over protection and voluntarily unlock. Omar spoke in Arabic to Natalie, something too quick for Jake to catch, but he saw her expression shift again, some internal decision being made. She checked her watch, an elegant piece that probably cost more than Jake used to make in a month, and he saw her calculate remaining time against unknown variables. Fine, she said, and the word carried the weight of desperation, making itself sound like command. You have 2 hours and 41 minutes. You open that vault in that time, and I'll give you... She paused, and something almost like black humor flickered across her face. $100 million. The number hung in the air like something from another universe, absurd and impossible. Jake saw Omar's eyebrows raise slightly, saw Dr. Foster's expression of disbelief, saw David Kim open his mouth to protest. Ma'am, David Kim started, but Natalie cut him off with a gesture. It's a joke, Mr. She looked at Jake expectantly. Carson. Jake Carson. Mr. Carson, obviously I'm not seriously offering you $100 million. But if you can solve this problem when 5 highly paid experts have failed, I assure you the compensation will be adequate. Jake met her eyes and saw something beneath the ice, some layer of genuine desperation that he recognized because it matched his own. I don't think you're joking, he said quietly. I think you're desperate enough to promise anything. Something flickered across her face, quick as lightning. Perhaps, she said, but I'm also a woman of my word. What do you need? If I fail, Jake said, I walk out of here. No police, no charges. I just leave. Natalie considered this for exactly 3 seconds. Agreed. But if you damage that vault further, then you're exactly where you are now, Jake finished. Nothing to lose. Omar said something in Arabic that Jake didn't catch, but the tone suggested approval, and Natalie nodded slowly. Do it, she said, but everyone steps back. If Mr. Carson is going to attempt this, he needs space to work. Jake approached the vault with the careful focus that had kept him alive in a war zone. That moment of narrowing where the world reduced to the problem at hand and everything else became background noise. Up close, he could see details the experts had missed, subtle patterns in the error codes, the way certain LED indicators flickered in sequences that weren't quite random. The quantum encryption isn't the real problem, he said, more to himself than to the watching audience. It's a red herring. The system is designed to make you think that's where the failure is occurring, but the actual issue is deeper. He began working the auxiliary systems, not attacking the vault directly, but manipulating the environmental sensors, the backup power indicators, the temperature monitoring that existed to protect the delicate electronics inside. His hands moved with the confidence of practice, and he could feel the experts watching him with the particular fascination of people watching someone solve a puzzle they themselves had failed. You're creating a controlled emergency, Omar said from behind him, understanding dawning in his voice, making the system believe it's in danger. Right, Jake said, his concentration never wavering. The safe's programming has hierarchical priorities. Security is priority 1, but system preservation is priority 0, the foundational directive that overrides everything else. If I can convince it that maintaining security will destroy the data it's meant to protect, it'll choose access over security. The vault's behavior began to change. Warning lights that had been dark suddenly activated. The rhythmic cycling of error codes became erratic. Emergency protocols that hadn't engaged during 3 hours of expert attempts suddenly came online, and Jake felt a familiar mixture of adrenaline and focus that he hadn't experienced since his last deployment. But then something unexpected happened. The Vault's AI proved more sophisticated than the equipment he'd trained on, and backup systems he hadn't anticipated began engaging. Multiple layers of security activated simultaneously, each one adding complexity to an already critical situation. Shit, Jake muttered, and felt his confidence waver for the first time. This is more complex than I thought. What did you do? David Kim asked, and his voice carried the edge of panic. You've triggered the fail-safe protocols. If this continues escalating, the Vault will permanently seal and destroy the encryption keys to prevent compromise. Jake felt sweat break out across his forehead, despite the office's aggressive air conditioning. He'd made it worse. He'd been so confident, so sure that his field experience would translate, and now he might have just destroyed everything these people were trying to protect. The weight of that failure pressed down on him with familiar force, the same weight he'd felt when the VA paperwork had gotten lost in bureaucracy, when the eviction notice had arrived, when he'd had to tell Emma they were going to live in the van for a while. But then he saw it, a pattern in the cascading errors that reminded him of Kandahar, of that IED in 2011 that had nearly killed his squad. The solution hadn't been to stop the cascade, but to complete it, to let the system exhaust itself, fighting its own security protocols until it had no choice but to reset. I need to make this worse before it gets better, Jake said, and the words felt insane even as he spoke them. Natalie's voice was sharp. What? No, stop what you're... Trust me, Jake said, and turned to look at her directly. I know how this ends. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Jake saw something shift in her expression. She was being asked to trust a homeless stranger who had broken into her building, to bet everything on a man she'd met 15 minutes ago, and he watched her make the decision in real time. Omar spoke in Arabic, something formal and rhythmic that had the cadence of a proverb, and Natalie nodded once sharply. Do it, she said. Jake turned back to the vault and began entering commands that would look to any observer like he was deliberately sabotaging the system. Environmental readings became catastrophically unstable. System diagnostics reported multiple critical failures across every subsystem. The conflict between security and preservation protocols escalated to a level that the Vault's programming had never been designed to handle. And then Emma's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Daddy? Jake spun around, and his heart stopped. Emma stood in the doorway, small and scared and holding her backpack. And he realized she must have followed him into the building when he'd told her to stay in the van, must have tracked him through the service corridors and found her way to this floor. The room froze again, but this time the freeze was different. Natalie Chen looked at Emma with an expression Jake couldn't quite read, something complex passing across her face. Omar's formal posture softened immediately, and even David Kim's professional irritation gave way to something gentler. How did you, Jake started, but Emma's scared expression stopped him. I got scared when you didn't come back, Emma said, her voice small. Are we in trouble? Jake felt something crack open in his chest, the careful compartmentalization he'd maintained between survival mode and father mode collapsing entirely. No, baby, he managed. It's going to be okay. Natalie made a decision quickly, turning to Omar with a gesture. Omar hesitated for just a moment, clearly outside his usual role, then nodded and approached Emma with the careful courtesy of someone who understood children deserve respect. Achter Taram and Latifla, he said quietly to someone on his phone. Then to Emma, come with me. Let your father finish his work. We'll get you something to eat. Emma looked at Jake, her expression full of questions and fear, and the particular trust of a child who had learned that her father's absences were necessary, but never truly safe. Go with them, sweetheart, Jake said, his voice rough. Daddy's almost done, I promise. Emma left with Omar, looking back twice, and Jake felt the weight of those looks like physical things. But there was no time to process what had just happened, because the vault was at its critical moment, and his hands were already moving through the final sequence of commands. He was creating an irreconcilable conflict in the vault's programming. forcing it to choose between security protocols that would result in data destruction and preservation protocols that required temporary access suspension. The system's artificial intelligence was sophisticated, but it was still bound by the logic its designers had built into it. And that logic had a breaking point. All the displays went dark simultaneously. Every warning light, every diagnostic indicator, every sound ceased in an instant that felt like the world holding its breath. Jake's hands froze over the control panel, and the silence in the room was absolute. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, nothing happened. The vault sat in complete darkness, its fate balanced on programming logic that no human had ever tested under these specific conditions. Then, with a soft electronic chime that sounded almost musical in the profound quiet, the massive steel door clicked open. The sound echoed through the office like a gunshot, and for several heartbeats nobody moved. Jake stood perfectly still, his chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline, staring at the slightly ajar door as if it might be an illusion. Behind him, he heard Dr. Foster make a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Heard David Kim whisper something that might have been a prayer or a curse. Natalie Chen walked slowly to the vault, her expensive heels clicking on marble, and pulled the door fully open. Inside, the climate-controlled interior held rows of organized files and documents, everything exactly as it had been 3 hours ago, preserved in perfect condition. She stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the door, and when she turned back to face Jake, her expression had transformed into something he couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complex, more calculating, more dangerous. "You actually did it," she said, and her voice carried wonder beneath the control. Jake felt his legs go weak, felt the adrenaline crash hitting him all at once. "Yeah," he said, and had to lock his knees to stay standing. "I did." $100 million, Natalie said, and the words hung in the air like a promise or a threat or a joke that nobody was quite sure how to read. "You were joking when you said that," Jake said, but even as the words came out, he wasn't entirely sure. "I was," Natalie admitted. Her eyes met his directly, and Jake saw something in them that he recognized despite the vast gulf of circumstances between them. The look of someone who understood what desperation could drive people to do. "But I'm not joking now." The chaos after the vault opened had the particular quality of controlled panic, transforming into efficient crisis management. Natalie's team descended on the open safe with practiced precision, extracting documents and encryption keys while verifying their integrity against digital backups. Jake watched from where he'd collapsed onto the leather sofa near the windows, his body processing the adrenaline crash with tremors he couldn't quite suppress. Combat veterans recognized this feeling, the way the nervous system needed time to understand that the immediate threat had passed and survival was no longer the primary directive. Emma returned with Omar carrying a plate of food from what must have been the executive dining room. Real food, not the convenience store purchases and donated meals that had become their standard. She approached Jake tentatively, her 8-year-old instincts reading his exhaustion as something that might be dangerous to interrupt. "It's okay, sweetheart." Jake pulled her close, feeling the solid warmth of her against his side. "We're okay now." Omar stood at a respectful distance, and Jake caught him watching the interaction with an expression that carried layers of meaning. The man had changed somehow in the past hour, the formal distance replaced by something closer to genuine interest. He pulled out his phone and spoke rapid Arabic to someone, his tone carrying the particular cadence of instructions being given to subordinates who understood that questions were not welcome. Natalie finished a phone call and turned to face the room, her posture shifting back into the commanding presence that clearly came naturally to her. "David, get those encryption keys verified and uploaded to the secure server. Dr. Foster, I need your analysis of what just happened here documented before you leave." Her eyes found Jake. "Mr. Carson, don't go anywhere. We need to talk." "Ma'am, I should probably—" Jake started, but she cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "You'll wait." Her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I have to leave for the Pentagon ceremony in 8 minutes. I'll be back in 3 hours. Omar will ensure you're comfortable." The command hung in the air, and Jake found himself nodding, despite the part of his brain that insisted staying here was a terrible idea, that he should grab Emma and disappear before anyone decided to call the police about his breaking and entering. But something about Natalie's expression, the way she looked at him with an intensity that went beyond professional assessment, kept him rooted in place. She left in a flurry of activity, taking David Kim and two other team members with her, and suddenly the office felt much larger and much quieter. Dr. Foster packed his equipment with the methodical care of someone whose brain was already writing the academic paper about what he'd witnessed. Omar settled into one of the leather chairs across from Jake. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested he'd decided something important. Sayed Carson, he began, then switched to English with barely an accent. Mr. Carson, that was remarkable work. Just doing what I know how to do. Jake's response came automatically, the deflection of praise that had become second nature. Omar's slight smile suggested he recognized the deflection for what it was. In my culture, we have a saying, fi thaqafati al-karam wajib. Hospitality is not just courtesy, it's sacred obligation. You helped us when you could have walked away. Now let me help you. He gestured toward a door that Jake hadn't noticed before, hidden in the wall paneling. There are shower facilities through there. Clean clothes in the executive locker room, various sizes. Take what you need. Your daughter can eat properly while you clean up. Jake's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the careful boundary between accepting help and becoming obligated. But Emma was already eating from the plate Omar had brought her, and Jake could see how hungry she was by the way she tried to eat slowly despite clearly wanting to devour everything at once. And he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a real shower, the kind with hot water and soap that actually lathered. Thank you. The words came out rougher than Jake intended. I appreciate it. The shower was everything Jake remembered real showers could be, hot water that lasted more than 3 minutes, soap that smelled like cedar and sandalwood instead of industrial detergent. He stood under the spray longer than necessary, feeling the knots in his shoulders start to release, the constant low-level tension of survival mode easing by degrees. When he finally emerged, he found clothes laid out that fit well enough. Khaki pants, a button-down shirt in dark blue, socks without holes. The transformation when he looked in the mirror was jarring. He looked almost like the person he used to want before Sarah died and the VA benefits disappeared, and the world revealed itself as something much more fragile than he'd believed. Emma had fallen asleep on the sofa, her small body curled around the now empty plate, and Jake felt something in his chest compress at the sight. She was exhausted, had probably been exhausted for months, but children were resilient in ways that made survival possible and left scars adults couldn't always see. Omar sat at his desk working on a laptop, and he looked up as Jake entered. Better? His tone suggested genuine interest rather than polite inquiry. Much. Jake settled into the chair across from the desk, hyper-aware of how the clean clothes changed his physical comfort, but couldn't quite erase the bone-deep knowledge of his circumstances. Can I ask you something? Omar closed the laptop, giving Jake his full attention. Of course. Why are you being nice to me? You're her investor. I broke into your building. The logical response would be calling the police, not offering showers and food. Omar leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I told you, hospitality is obligation in my culture, but you're right that there's more to it than that. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I recognize something in you, the way you move, the way you assess situations before acting, the way you solve that problem. You're not just a desperate man, you're a capable man circumstances have broken, and there's a difference. Jake felt the observation settle over him, uncomfortable in its accuracy. And that matters to you, why? Because I understand what it's like to be measured by the wrong standards. Omar's voice carried a new edge. In Abu Dhabi, I'm considered too Western for traditional business. In London, I was too Arab. In Silicon Valley, I'm exotic curiosity or terrorist threat depending on the day's news cycle. So when I see genuine capability dismissed because of appearances, I pay attention. The honesty in Omar's voice created a space for reciprocal honesty, and Jake found himself talking about things he normally kept locked down. 4 years Army, combat engineer. Saw things in Iraq and Afghanistan that made civilian problems seem manageable until they weren't. Lost my wife 18 months ago to a drunk driver. VA benefits got tangled in bureaucracy over some paperwork technicality. Lost the apartment 4 months ago. Been living in my van with Emma ever since. Omar listened without interruption, his dark eyes steady. And your family? Parents who could help? Dad died 2 years ago. Heart attack at 63. Mom's in a nursing home in Ohio with advanced dementia. Even if she understood what was happening, she's on Medicaid and can't help financially. Jake heard the defensive edge creeping into his voice and tried to moderate it. I tried to make it work. Applied for jobs, dozens of them. But combat engineer doesn't translate to civilian resumes. No degree, homeless address, 4-month employment gap. HR software filters me out before humans see my applications. NAM, the system is designed for those who already fit its patterns. Omar's voice carried the weight of personal experience. It punishes deviation. They sat in silence for several minutes, the kind of comfortable quiet that only came when two people recognized something fundamental in each other. On the television mounted to the wall, a news channel showed live coverage of the Pentagon ceremony, and Jake watched Natalie Chen sign the contract that would have been impossible without his intervention. She looked different on camera, more polished and remote, but Jake remembered the desperation he'd seen in her eyes when she'd stood before the locked vault. She will keep her promise, Omar said, following Jake's gaze. Inisa mithala latiksurna kelimatahun. Women like Natalie don't break their word. It's how they survive in rooms that don't want them there. You think she was serious? About the 100 million? Omar's expression suggested the question itself revealed Jake's incomplete understanding of who Natalie Chen was. She never jokes about money. It's one of the things that makes her exceptional and difficult in equal measure. Difficult how? Omar considered the question with the care of someone choosing whether to betray a confidence or provide necessary context. She's brilliant and driven and completely incapable of trusting that brilliance is enough. Always proving herself, always fighting, always certain that any weakness will be used against her. Her marriage ended because her husband couldn't accept that she was more successful than him, and she's convinced herself that being alone is safer than being vulnerable. Jake thought about the woman who told him to trust her judgment, who'd bet everything on a homeless stranger's claim to expertise. That doesn't sound like someone afraid of vulnerability. No, Omar's smile was sad. She trusted you with her vault, not with anything that matters more. When was the last time she asked for help rather than hiring someone to provide a service? The question hung between them, and Jake didn't have an answer. On the television, Natalie was shaking hands with a general whose chest carried enough ribbons to suggest he'd seen his own share of impossible situations. And Jake wondered what it cost her to smile that confidently for cameras when 3 hours ago, she'd been watching her company face annihilation. What about you? Jake heard himself ask. You said you understand being measured by wrong standards. What's your story? Omar's expression shifted into something more guarded, but he answered, 35 years old, unmarried, managing billions in international investments. In my family, in my culture, that's shameful. I should have wife and children by now, should have accepted one of the arranged marriages my mother has been orchestrating since I was 25. But I was educated in London, worked in Singapore and New York, and I can't quite fit myself back into the traditional expectations. So you're avoiding home. Omar's laugh was sharp and genuine. Is it that obvious? I take longer trips than necessary, find more investments that require extended oversight. My mother calls every week to tell me about suitable women from good families. And every week I find reasons why now is not the right time. The honesty in Omar's admission created a strange intimacy, two men from entirely different worlds discovering they were both in some way exiles from the places that should have been home. They talked for the next 2 hours, the conversation ranging from combat engineering to Gulf politics to the particular challenges of maintaining dignity when circumstances were actively working to strip it away. Emma woke up once, disoriented, and Jake settled her back to sleep with the practiced efficiency of single parenthood. When Natalie finally returned, the early afternoon light was slanting through the floor-to-ceiling windows at a steep angle. She entered her office with the quick stride of someone who just successfully navigated a high-stakes situation, but Jake could see the exhaustion beneath her professional composure. Her eyes found him immediately, and something complicated passed across her face. Mr. Carson. Her voice was carefully neutral. Thank you for waiting. Jake stood, suddenly aware again of how borrowed his clean appearance was, how fundamentally unchanged his circumstances remained despite the shower and the clothes. You said we needed to talk. We do. She glanced at Emma sleeping on the sofa, and her expression softened imperceptibly. But perhaps somewhere more private. Omar, would you mind? Omar was already standing, his movements suggesting he'd anticipated this request. I'll ensure Emma stays comfortable. Take your time. Natalie led Jake to a conference room down the hall, smaller and more intimate than her main office, with a table that could seat 8, but was empty except for 2 leather chairs positioned by the windows. She gestured for him to sit, then surprised him by taking the chair next to his rather than across, eliminating the formal barrier of the table. $4.5 billion, she said without preamble. That's what you saved when you opened my vault. The contract's signed, the encryption keys are secure, and my company's reputation is intact. So yes, Mr. Carson, I was serious about the $100 million. The number still sounded impossible, a figure from a different universe. Jake's brain tried to process what $100 million could mean. Permanent housing, Emma's education secured through graduate school, never worrying about winter coats or food, or whether the van would start on cold mornings. But the scope exceeded his ability to visualize. You can't be serious? The words came out flat, drained of the emotion Jake was too exhausted to summon. That's insane compensation for 90 minutes of work. Is it? Natalie's dark eyes held his steadily. My security team combined bills at approximately $50,000 per hour. They worked for 3 hours and failed completely. You succeeded in 90 minutes. By any reasonable ROI calculation, you are worth more than all of them combined. That's just business logic. There has to be a catch. Natalie's expression shifted, and Jake saw something behind the professional mask, something that looked almost like hurt. A catch? What kind of catch do you imagine? Jake felt the old anger rising, the accumulated resentment of 4 months watching people walk past him on the street without seeing him, of HR algorithms rejecting his applications, of knowing that his competence meant nothing if it came packaged in homelessness. People like you don't give money to people like me without strings attached. You'll want me to work for you, sign some NDA that gives you rights to anything I develop, lock me into a contract that makes this feel like generosity instead of obligation. People like me. Natalie's voice was very quiet, very controlled, and Jake recognized the tone from his own attempts to contain fury through precision. You mean CEOs, successful people, those who've never missed a meal or worried about their daughter's shoes? The accuracy of the accusation stung precisely because Jake had thought exactly those things. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that suspicion was rational after months of discovering that systems were designed to work against people like him. But something in Natalie's expression stopped him. You're right, her voice was still quiet, but something fundamental had shifted. I haven't missed a meal in decades. I don't worry about shoes or rent or whether I can afford heat in winter. But don't assume that means I don't understand what it's like to be dismissed. Jake felt the conversation pivoting into territory he hadn't anticipated, and he made himself stay silent to listen. My parents immigrated from Taiwan when my mother was pregnant with me. Natalie's words came faster now, as if she'd opened a door she usually kept locked and needed to get through it quickly before reconsidering. My father worked 3 jobs: restaurant, taxi driver, night janitor. My mother cleaned houses. They wanted me to be accountant or doctor, something safe and respectable. When I said I wanted to study engineering, my father told me, "Nuhai zuopulaojiga. Girls can't do this kind of work." She paused, and Jake saw her hands tighten in her lap before she consciously relaxed them. I got a full scholarship to Stanford, fought for every opportunity in classes where professors called on me, last if at all, where study groups formed without me, where I had to be twice as prepared to be considered half as competent. Built this company from $50,000 in savings and 7 years of 20-hour days. And every single board meeting, every investor pitch, every contract negotiation, I fight the assumption that I'm secretary or assistant or diversity hire. The bitterness in her voice was controlled but unmistakable, and Jake felt his defensive anger deflating in the face of pain that mirrored his own in different key. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have assumed. Yes, you should have. Natalie's interjection was sharp. You should be suspicious. Systems do have strings, and powerful people do exploit vulnerability. You'd be a fool to trust me blindly, but don't confuse caution with assuming the worst. Then what do you actually want from me? Natalie was silent for long enough that Jake thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice carried vulnerability he hadn't heard before. I want to recognize value everyone else missed, the same way someone recognized mine when they gave me the scholarship that changed my life. I'm not offering charity or creating obligation. I'm acknowledging that you saved something I couldn't save myself, and that has worth. Jake wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that the offer could be straightforward, but survival instinct warred with the pull of her obvious sincerity. What would I do with $100 million? The question emerged almost involuntarily. Genuinely, what would someone like me do with that kind of money? Natalie leaned forward slightly, her body language shifting from defensive to engaged. What would you do if you believed the money was real and yours without conditions? What would you change? Jake looked out the window at Manhattan spreading below them, all those buildings full of people pursuing their own versions of survival or success, and he thought about the question seriously for the first time. First, get Emma and me into real housing, somewhere stable, safe, where she can go to school consistently and make friends without worrying we'll disappear overnight. Essential, Natalie agreed. And then I'd make sure other veterans don't end up where I ended up. The answer surprised Jake with its immediacy, with how completely formed the thought was despite never having voiced it before. The system's broken for people coming home from war. Smart men and women who can solve complex problems under pressure, who have skills that should translate to civilian success, but they can't get past HR algorithms or resume requirements or employment gaps. Natalie was watching him with an intensity that made Jake hyper-aware of her proximity, of the way her attention felt like being seen rather than merely looked at. Keep going. What would that look like practically? Jake's mind was racing now, connecting ideas that had been forming in the background of his survival calculations for months. You'd need to create new ways for people to prove capability. Not resumes or interviews, but actual problems to solve. Real challenges where success or failure is objective. Then connect people who succeed with companies that need their specific skills. So a talent identification program that bypasses traditional gatekeeping. Natalie's voice carried excitement beneath the professional assessment. What about scale? Would it be just veterans? Jake thought about the other people he'd met in shelters and food banks, the single parents trying to work while caring for kids, the ex-convicts whose prison time had taught them skills no college offered, the immigrants whose degrees from other countries meant nothing to American employers. No, not just veterans, anyone with non-traditional backgrounds who can demonstrate capability if given the chance. You're describing a fundamental challenge to how hiring works. Natalie's statement wasn't criticism, just observation. I'm describing common sense. Judge people by what they can do, not by what's printed on paper or where they've been. The silence that followed felt different from earlier silences, charged with possibility rather than tension. Natalie was looking at him with an expression Jake couldn't quite read, something between calculation and something else, something warmer. What if it wasn't just an idea? Her voice was careful, testing. What if we actually built it? We? Jake heard the pronoun and understood it carried weight beyond grammar. You'd control the mission and selection criteria. You understand what it's like to be overlooked, what matters on the ground. I'd provide business infrastructure, corporate partnerships, operational expertise. Omar would bring international investment and scaling resources. She paused. We'd be partners. Partners. Jake tested the word, found it strange in his mouth. I don't know how to run a foundation. I fix engines and defuse bombs, and I'll teach you business operations. You'll teach me what matters to people the system has failed. Natalie's voice carried conviction that brooked no argument. Sometimes the best people to change a system are those it's harmed most. The truth of that statement settled over Jake like recognition, and for the first time since Sarah died, he felt something other than the crushing weight of survival. He felt possibility, fragile and terrifying, but real. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Omar. Emma's awake and asking for you, no emergency, just wants to know you're close. I should get back to her. Jake stood, and Natalie rose with him, and they were suddenly very close in the small conference room. Think about what I've said. Natalie's voice was softer now. Not just the money, though, that's real, but what we could build together. What proving credentials don't matter as much as capability could mean. Their eyes met, and Jake felt something pass between them that had nothing to do with business proposals and everything to do with the way she'd said together, with the way she looked at him like he was someone worth building something with rather than someone to be managed or helped. I'll think about it. His voice came out rougher than intended. And thank you for believing I could open your vault when everyone else said I couldn't. Thank you for proving me right. Natalie's slight smile transformed her face, made her look younger and less defended. Get back to your daughter. We'll talk more soon. Jake returned to Omar's office to find Emma awake and eating from another plate of food, this one with actual vegetables and what looked like grilled chicken. She brightened when she saw him, and the relief in her expression made Jake's chest tighten. Everything okay, Daddy? Her 8-year-old radar for adult tension was fully engaged. Everything's good, sweetheart. Better than good. Jake pulled her close, breathing in the smell of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her against the surreal nature of everything else. We're going to be okay. Omar was watching them with an expression that carried unexpected emotion. And when Emma settled back to her food, he gestured for Jake to step aside. Natalie asked me to ensure you have a place to stay tonight. Her guest suite in the penthouse is available. Jake's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain independence. But he looked at Emma eating real food in a warm room and made himself consider what was actually best for her rather than what protected his pride. That's generous, but I can't accept. You can and you will. Omar's voice was firm. Your daughter needs proper rest, and so do you. Tomorrow you can make decisions about longer-term arrangements. Tonight, accept help. The logic was irrefutable, and Jake found himself nodding despite every instinct that insisted accepting too much help meant surrendering too much autonomy. Okay, thank you. The penthouse was 3 floors above Natalie's office, accessible via a private elevator that required a key card Omar provided. It was smaller than Jake expected, though that was relative, probably still 3 times the size of any apartment he'd ever lived in. But it was decorated more for comfort than display, with furniture that looked used and books on shelves that appeared actually read. Emma explored with the cautious delight of a child who'd learned that good things were temporary, and Jake watched her discover the guest bedroom with its own bathroom and soft bed and window overlooking the city lights. She turned to him with eyes wide, her question silent but obvious. Yes, baby, you can sleep in a real bed tonight. Jake felt emotion threatening to crack his carefully maintained composure. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next, but tonight we're safe. Emma launched herself at him, and Jake caught her, felt her small arms tight around his neck, felt her relief and exhaustion and the accumulated stress of 4 months living in a van, all releasing at once. She cried for a while, and Jake held her and let his own tears fall silently, and they stayed like that until Emma's breathing evened out into something approaching peace. He carried her to the bed and tucked her in, and she was asleep before he finished. Jake stood watching her for a long time, memorizing this moment of safety, trying to believe it could be the beginning of something permanent rather than just a temporary respite. A soft knock on the main door pulled him from the guest room. Natalie stood in the hallway, changed from her business suit into jeans and a sweater, looking simultaneously more casual and more uncertain than Jake had seen her. I wanted to check that you had everything you needed. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Jake saw her glance past him toward the guest room where Emma slept. More than everything. Thank you for this. Natalie nodded, and for a moment they stood in the doorway in silence. Then she said, seemingly without planning to, would you like coffee? I was about to make some, and I find I don't want to be alone right now. The admission hung between them, vulnerable in a way that matched nothing else Jake had seen from her today. He should say no, should maintain boundaries, should remember that she was a billionaire CEO and he was a homeless veteran, and the space between those positions was too vast to cross. But he heard himself say, yes, coffee sounds good. They sat in her living room, coffee forgotten on the table between them, and talked about things that had nothing to do with vaults or foundations or money. Natalie told him about her ex-husband, a marketing executive who'd proposed a month after they met and filed for divorce 2 years later, unable to accept that she made 10 times his salary and worked twice his hours. He told me I emasculated him by being successful, she said, her voice carefully flat. Said I cared more about the company than about him. He was right about the second part. I don't know how to be both successful and loved. The raw honesty in her admission created space for Jake's own truth. I dream about the accident every night. The drunk driver running the red light, Sarah's car crumpling, getting to the hospital too late. Sometimes I can't remember her face clearly anymore, and that terrifies me more than being homeless. Like I'm failing her twice. Once by not protecting her, and again by letting the memory fade. Natalie was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights beyond the windows. You're not failing anyone. You're surviving impossible circumstances while protecting your daughter. That's not failure. That's heroism. I don't feel like a hero. I feel like I'm drowning and barely keeping Emma's head above water. Maybe that's what heroism actually is. Not cape wearing and building leaping, but just showing up every day when giving up would be easier. Natalie's voice was soft, and when Jake looked at her, he saw tears tracking silently down her cheeks. I'm sorry, I don't let people see. Hey, Jake reached across the space between them and took her hand, the gesture instinctive and intimate. It's okay. Their fingers interlaced, and they sat like that for several heartbeats, neither moving closer nor pulling away. The city spread out below them, millions of people pursuing their own versions of survival and success and connection. And Jake thought about how unlikely this moment was, how impossible it should be that he was sitting in a penthouse holding hands with a woman who existed in a completely different world. Natalie was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone else? Jake nodded, afraid that speaking would break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. I'm terrified all the time of failing, of being exposed as someone who got lucky rather than earned success, of ending up alone because I'm too driven or too cold or too much. Today, when the vault wouldn't open, I thought, this is it. This is when everyone learns I'm not actually capable enough. And then you showed up and solved it, and I didn't know whether to be grateful or resentful that I needed rescuing. Jake's thumb moved across the back of her hand almost unconsciously. You weren't rescued. You made a strategic decision to accept help from an unconventional source. That's leadership, not weakness. Is it? Or was it desperation disguised as leadership? Maybe there's no difference. Maybe the best decisions come when you're desperate enough to see past conventional wisdom. Natalie turned to look at him directly, and the intensity in her gaze made Jake's breath catch. I'm not desperate anymore. The vault's open, the contract's signed, the crisis is over, but I'm still sitting here with you. What does that mean? Jake felt his heartbeat accelerate, felt the moment crystallizing into something that would require a choice. I think it means we're both tired of being alone. She moved first, leaning across the small space between them, and their kiss was tentative, careful, a question rather than an answer. Jake's hand came up to cup her face, feeling the softness of her skin against his palm, and they stayed frozen in that moment of contact, both aware they were crossing a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. When they separated, Natalie's eyes were wide. That was, should we have, I don't know. Jake's voice was rough with emotion and desire and something else, something that felt like hope. But I'm not sorry. Neither am I. She took his hand again, held it between both of hers. But Jake, this is complicated. You're in an incredibly vulnerable position, and I have power over. You don't have power over me. Jake's interjection was firm. You made an offer. I can accept or refuse. That's not power imbalance. That's negotiation between adults. Is it that simple? No, probably not. But maybe we don't need to solve everything tonight. They talked until well past midnight, the conversation ranging across their lives and fears and the strange impossibility of where they found themselves. Jake learned that Natalie played piano badly but loved it anyway, that she'd been engaged once before her marriage to a man who'd broken it off when she got into Stanford and he didn't, that she sometimes missed the simplicity of being broke and hungry and certain that success would solve everything. Natalie learned that Jake had been a high school football star who joined the Army because college felt impossibly expensive, that he could still field strip and reassemble an M4 rifle blindfolded, but couldn't remember the last time he'd done something purely for pleasure, that he felt guilty every time Emma smiled because it meant she was adapting to homelessness instead of being properly traumatized by it. When Jake finally returned to the guest suite, the sky beyond the windows was beginning to lighten with the false dawn that preceded sunrise. Emma was still sleeping soundly, and Jake stood in the doorway watching her, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he'd woken in a van, desperate and hungry, and focused entirely on survival. Now he stood in a penthouse, $100 million promised to him, a foundation being planned, and the memory of kissing a woman who seemed to see past his circumstances to the person beneath. It felt fragile, all of it, like a dream that would evaporate when reality reasserted itself. But Emma's sleeping form was real, and the bed beneath her was real, and the warmth in his chest when he thought about Natalie was real, even if it was terrifying. He was afraid to believe it could last, but for the first time in 18 months, Jake Carson let himself believe it was possible. Word count, 6,843 words. 90 days transformed Jake Carson's external circumstances while leaving his internal landscape a battlefield of doubt and disbelieving vigilance. The two-bedroom apartment in Queens occupied the third floor of a building where the heat worked and the neighbors minded their own business. And Jake woke every morning convinced he would discover it had all been an elaborate dream. Emma attended PS 122 now, where teachers knew her name and her homework came home in folders designed for that purpose. And she'd made a friend named Sophie who invited her to birthday parties at places that charged admission. The Carson Foundation operated from a converted warehouse in Long Island City, open-plan space with exposed brick and windows that let in the kind of natural light Jake had forgotten workspace could contain. His team consisted of 8 people, 3 formerly homeless veterans who understood the population they served, 2 ex-corporate refugees who believed in the mission enough to accept nonprofit salaries, 1 formerly incarcerated systems analyst whose resume would have been automatically rejected by any traditional employer, and 2 administrative staff who kept the chaos organized. Jake spent his days reviewing applications and designing practical assessment challenges, work that felt simultaneously crucial and completely outside his competence. The nightmares persisted. Sarah's accident replayed with variations his sleeping mind invented to maximize horror. And Jake would wake at 3 a.m. in sheets soaked with sweat, his heart racing with the particular panic that came from knowing you'd failed to protect something precious. Sometimes the dreams shifted, and it was Emma in the crushed vehicle, or the vault ceiling permanently while she was somehow inside, or he was back in Kandahar watching his squad disappear in an IED explosion that civilian life had taught him to fear in retrospect. Therapy twice a week with Dr. Martinez, a VA psychologist Natalie had connected him with and Omar Farr had funded. The sessions excavated pain Jake had buried under survival imperatives, and he discovered that carrying his daughter through homelessness while maintaining the pretense that everything would be okay had required a level of dissociation that didn't simply vanish when circumstances improved. "You're experiencing delayed trauma response," Dr. Martinez explained in her office overlooking Prospect Park. "Your nervous system is finally safe enough to process what you've survived." Natalie visited the foundation office every Tuesday morning for what they publicly called strategy sessions, and privately acknowledged had become the axis around which Jake's week rotated. They were careful in public, maintaining professional distance, but Jake felt her presence like magnetic pull. The way his attention tracked her movements across a room, the way conversation felt incomplete unless she was part of it. They hadn't repeated the kiss from that first night in her penthouse, both of them apparently determined to prove that what was growing between them could survive being more than impulse. This Tuesday found them reviewing the first cohort of candidates, 12 people selected from 127 applications. Maria Santos had been a corrections officer before teaching herself programming in prison library computers, creating an inmate request management system that reduced processing time by 40%. Tommy Wu had spent 15 years working restaurant kitchens, and in that time had designed workflow optimizations that his last employer claimed saved $50,000 annually. Keisha Williams was raising 3 kids in public housing while building a community resource network that connected neighbors with skills to neighbors with needs. I don't know if I'm choosing the right people, Jake admitted, the fear that had been building for weeks finally finding voice. What if they fail? What if I place them and they screw up? And it proves everyone right that credentials matter. Natalie leaned forward across the conference table, and her hand moved as if to touch his before she caught herself and redirected the gesture into reaching for her coffee. These are exactly right. Every one of them demonstrates capability that traditional systems missed. If some don't succeed in first placement, we adjust and try different approaches. But the stakes, Jake started, and Natalie interrupted with the particular firmness she employed when he was catastrophizing. The stakes are that we learn what works and what doesn't. That's what startups do. They iterate towards success. Her confidence should have been reassuring, but Jake felt the weight of 12 lives depending on decisions he was making without credentials or experience or any proof he could do this beyond Natalie's and Omar's faith in him. Emma had asked him the previous week if Miss Natalie was his girlfriend, and Jake had deflected with parental evasion that fooled neither of them, and the memory made him aware of how much was entangled now, how failure would ripple across multiple domains of his life. The placements happened over 3 weeks. Maria Santos joined a mid-sized tech company as junior developer. Tommy Wu went to a logistics firm handling operations optimization. Keisha landed at a nonprofit coordinating community programs. The others dispersed across companies that had agreed to try the foundation's experimental approach to talent identification, and Jake felt each placement like sending soldiers into combat with inadequate intelligence about what they would face. Week 3 brought the phone call Jake had been dreading. Tommy Wu at 10 p.m., his voice tight with frustration and shame. I quit. I can't do this. Everyone there has degrees. They talk in business jargon I don't understand. I'm in meetings and I feel like an idiot. Jake grabbed his jacket and met Tommy at a diner in Queens 30 minutes later, the kind of place that stayed open late and asked no questions about who occupied its booths. Tommy was 41 and looked older, weathered by the particular exhaustion of working-class employment that broke bodies down through repetition. He'd been proud when Jake placed him, had talked about finally proving that street-level intelligence counted for something. Now he stared at coffee he wasn't drinking and wouldn't meet Jake's eyes. My boss asked me to leverage synergies in the Q4 deliverables. I had no idea what that meant. Just stared at him like an idiot. Everyone in that meeting knew I didn't belong there. Did you tell him you didn't understand? Jake kept his voice level, fighting his own panic that the first placement was already failing. And look stupid? Prove them right that I don't belong? Tommy's laugh was bitter. You gave me this shot and I'm wasting it because I can't speak their language. Jake felt the failure settling over him like familiar weight, confirmation that his instincts were wrong, that Natalie's faith in him was misplaced. But then he thought about his own experience. The way the VA system had its own impenetrable jargon. The way corporate job postings might as well have been written in code. The problem wasn't Tommy's capability. It was that corporate culture had its own language, assumptions, unwritten rules that no amount of skill could navigate without translation. What if we taught you the language? The idea formed as Jake spoke it, solution emerging from the problem itself. Not changing who you are or what you know, but giving you tools to translate your expertise into terms they understand. Tommy looked up, skeptical, but listening. How? Jake called Natalie despite the hour, and she answered on the second ring, her voice alert in a way that suggested she'd been working. We need transition coaches, former executives who can teach our candidates corporate literacy, not what to think, but how to communicate in business environments. Silence on the line for 3 heartbeats. Then, I love it. I'll fund it immediately. I know people who'd volunteer. Her voice shifted, became softer. Are you okay? Jake glanced at Tommy, who was watching him with the desperate hope of someone who needed to believe rescue was possible. Yeah, dealing with our first crisis, but I think we've got a solution. Come over when you're done. I'll be awake. The simple invitation carried layers of meaning, and Jake felt his chest tighten with want and caution in equal measure. Maybe. If it's not too late, it's never too late. 3 words that could mean anything or everything, and then Natalie disconnected. Jake spent another hour with Tommy, outlining the coaching program that would pair candidates with mentors who understood corporate culture as a learnable system rather than an innate quality. By the time they parted, Tommy had agreed to return to his placement with support, and Jake felt the small victory as profound relief. The drive to Natalie's penthouse took 20 minutes, and Jake used the time to argue with himself about whether this was wise. They'd been so careful, maintaining boundaries, proving that what existed between them could be professional first. But he found himself in the private elevator anyway, found himself knocking on her door at midnight, found her opening it in jeans and an MIT sweatshirt with her hair down in a way he'd never seen. "Tommy, okay?" She stepped back to let him enter, and the apartment smelled like jasmine tea and the particular quiet of late-night solitude. "Will be. We caught it before he actually quit." Jake set his keys on the entry table, hyper-aware of how domestic the gesture felt. "Thanks for answering." "Of course." Natalie moved to the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of wine without asking if he wanted any, handed him one. "Tell me about it." They sat on her couch and Jake explained the situation, his solution, his fear that every crisis would reveal his fundamental inadequacy for the role he'd accepted. Natalie listened without interruption, and when he finished, she set her wine down and turned to face him fully. "You're not inadequate. You identified a problem none of us anticipated and developed an immediate solution. That's exactly the leadership this foundation needs." "I got lucky." Jake heard the defensive edge in his voice. "What happens when luck runs out?" "Luck?" Natalie's voice sharpened. "Jake, you've placed 12 people in positions they couldn't access through traditional systems. You've created assessment criteria that identify capability our society systematically ignores. You've built a team of people who believe in this mission because you've lived what they're trying to escape. That's not luck. That's vision." "I don't feel like I have vision. I feel like I'm drowning." Maybe that's what vision actually is. Not confidence, but willingness to keep moving forward even when you're terrified. Jake set his own wine down, and they were suddenly very close on the couch, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, could smell her shampoo. "Natalie, why are you fighting so hard for this? For me?" Her expression shifted into something vulnerable that he'd only glimpsed before. "Because I see you, not the homeless veteran who broke into my building, not the person's circumstances broke, the capable man who solved my impossible problem and who's building something that matters. And because," her voice dropped to barely above whisper, "because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that first night." Jake's hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone. "We said we'd keep this professional." "I know what we said." Natalie's eyes held his steadily. "I'm saying I don't want to anymore." The kiss was different from their first, less tentative, carrying the accumulated weight of 3 months of careful distance and growing need. Jake's other hand found the small of her back, pulling her closer, and Natalie's fingers threaded through his hair. They stayed like that for long moments, the kiss deepening into something that spoke of desperation and loneliness and the human need to be seen and wanted, despite or because of all the broken places. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Natalie rested her forehead against his. "Stay tonight, not just on the couch. Stay with me." "Emma," Jake started, and Natalie interrupted, "is safe with Mrs. Chen downstairs, who you pay to watch her when you work late, and who knows how to reach you in emergency. She'll be fine for one night. The question is whether you want to." Jake answered by kissing her again, and they moved to her bedroom with the awkward urgency of people who'd been denying desire for too long. Later, lying in her bed with her head on his chest and Manhattan glowing beyond the windows, Jake felt something in him uncoil, some defensive tension he'd been carrying for 18 months finally releasing. "I still dream about Sarah," he said into the darkness. "About the accident. About failing to protect her." Natalie's hand found his, their fingers interlacing. "Does it feel like betrayal? Being here with me?" "Sometimes. Then I think about how she'd want Emma to have stability, how she'd want me to be happy. And I think maybe moving forward isn't betrayal. It's not." Natalie's voice was firm. "It's survival. It's choosing to live instead of just existing. That's not dishonoring her memory. It's honoring what she'd want for you." They talked until dawn, the conversation ranging across fear and hope and the strange territory of learning to trust someone new with the damaged parts of yourself. Natalie told him her marriage had ended when she'd gotten promoted and her husband had thrown the celebration dinner invitation at her, screaming that she'd finally achieved her goal of making him irrelevant. Jake told her about Emma's nightmares, how his daughter woke sometimes asking if they had to go back to the van, how success felt fragile because poverty had taught him that security was always temporary. When Jake returned to his apartment in Queens the next morning, Emma was eating breakfast with Mrs. Chen, and she looked at him with the particular knowing expression of children who see more than adults want to believe. "Did you stay at Miss Natalie's house?" "Yes," Jake felt his face heat. "We were working late and it made more sense than driving home." "Uh-huh," Emma's tone suggested complete disbelief. "That's why you're smiling like that." "Like what?" "Like Mommy used to make you smile." The observation hit Jake square in the chest and he knelt to Emma's level. "Baby, does it bother you that I might have feelings for Miss Natalie?" Emma considered the question with 8-year-old seriousness. "Mommy would want you to be happy. She told me that before the accident, that if anything happened to her, you shouldn't be sad forever. So no, it doesn't bother me." She paused. "I like Miss Natalie. She talks to me like I'm real instead of just a kid." Jake pulled Emma into a hug, feeling emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "You're very wise, you know that?" "I know." Emma's response was matter of fact. "Sophie says I'm weird, but I think I'm just smart." The Foundation's mixed results over the next 3 months tested Jake's fragile confidence repeatedly. Maria Santos excelled, earning a promotion to mid-level developer within 2 months. Keisha Williams thrived. Her community program model adopted citywide. But 3 candidates from the first cohort didn't work in their initial placements and returned to the Foundation for reassessment. 2 partner companies withdrew, saying they weren't ready for this kind of experimentation. Media attention intensified. 60 Minutes sent a crew to film a profile titled The $100 Million Bet, and Jake endured the interview with barely concealed discomfort while Natalie handled the cameras with practiced ease. Conservative critics called the Foundation reckless social engineering. Progressive critics accused them of capitalism co-opting social justice. Jake found himself defending the work in ways that felt simultaneously righteous and exhausting. His relationship with Natalie stopped being secret when a Wall Street Journal photographer caught them leaving a restaurant together, her hand in his, both of them laughing at something Jake couldn't even remember now. The photo ran with speculation about whether the Foundation's credibility would survive its founder dating his primary benefactor. Jake's first instinct was to end things, to protect the mission from scandal, but Natalie refused. "Let them talk." Her voice carried steel. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're 2 adults in a relationship, and our personal life doesn't diminish the Foundation's work. But what if donors pull funding because they think—" Jake started and Natalie cut him off. "Then they weren't the right donors. We're building something that changes how society identifies capability." That's bigger than gossip. Jake wanted to believe her, but the fear that his relationship with Natalie would become the story instead of the Foundation's mission gnawed at him constantly. Emma handled the attention with more grace than Jake, telling her classmates that her dad was helping people, and that was cooler than being on TV. Omar called from Abu Dhabi with news that Gulf State investment funds wanted to pilot similar programs, and would Jake consider expanding internationally? The conversation made Jake's head spin. 6 months ago, he'd been surviving day to day. Now he was being asked to think about global workforce development initiatives. "I can barely manage New York," he told Omar. "How do I scale to 5 countries? Iston Billah thumma tawakkal alayh. Trust in God and take the first step." Omar's voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to building things across borders. "You hire people who know those markets, give them the framework you've developed, and trust them to adapt it. That sounds like losing control. That sounds like leadership. Delegation isn't losing control. It's multiplying your impact." The Foundation approached month 8 with cash burn that threatened to exhaust the $100 million within 18 months. Jake lay awake calculating runway and sustainability, and the old fear of losing everything crept back with familiar weight. They needed revenue model, not just charitable spending. The pivot emerged from necessity. Instead of just placing candidates in existing jobs, what if they trained them as consultants? Companies could pay the Foundation for project-based work, candidates would earn while demonstrating capability, and the Foundation would take a percentage that sustained operations. "We're not charity." Jake explained the model to his team. "We're a talent agency for overlooked capability. We prove value through results, then charge for access." Natalie loved it immediately, seeing the business logic that would make the foundation sustainable. Omar committed Gulf Investment to fund the transition. The first project arrived within weeks, a manufacturing company with chronic efficiency problems, offering $200,000 if the foundation could solve what corporate consultants estimated would take 6 months. Jake assembled a team, Tommy Wu on operations, Maria Santos handling data analysis, a former construction worker whose spatial reasoning was extraordinary, two other candidates with relevant expertise. They attacked the problem with the particular creativity that came from non-traditional backgrounds and solved it in 3 weeks. The manufacturing company saved $2 million annually and immediately placed orders for more projects. Then the Wall Street Journal published the anonymous tip that would nearly destroy everything Jake had built. The story alleged the foundation was manufacturing success stories, that several candidates had been already employed when placed, that the whole operation was sophisticated fraud designed to enrich Jake Carson through deception. The accusations came with fabricated documentation that looked convincing enough to trigger immediate donor withdrawal and corporate partner reconsideration. Jake read the article on his phone while riding the subway to the office and felt his entire world crack open. Every fear he'd suppressed came flooding back, that he was a fraud, that he'd been lucky once and mistaken luck for capability, that his relationship with Natalie had corrupted the mission's integrity. By the time he reached Long Island City, he'd decided to resign before the scandal destroyed the foundation completely. Natalie found him in his office packing his personal items into a cardboard box, and her expression cycled through confusion and fury and something that looked like heartbreak. "What are you doing? The right thing." Jake couldn't meet her eyes. "Stepping down before I destroy what we've built. The accusations might be false, but donors won't care. Partners won't care. I'm the liability. If I leave, maybe the foundation survives." Natalie crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed his hands, stopping his packing. "No, we fight this. We provide every document, every verification, every piece of evidence that proves these allegations are lies." "Natalie, look at the optics. Homeless veteran given $100 million by woman he's dating starts foundation that conveniently employs people like him. Even if we prove the allegations false, the story writes itself. So we let them win, let whoever planted this story destroy something that's actually helping people because we're afraid of optics? I'm trying to protect what?" Natalie's voice broke and Jake finally looked at her to see tears tracking down her face. "You think stepping down protects the foundation? It confirms guilt. It says we have something to hide. Maybe we do." Jake heard the words emerge and couldn't stop them. "Maybe I was never qualified for this. Maybe everyone was right that credentials matter, and I'm just a washed-up veteran who got lucky once. Don't you dare." Natalie's voice turned fierce. "Don't you dare let them make you doubt yourself. You've placed 67 people in 6 months. You've created assessment methodology that identifies capability our entire society misses. You've proven that judging people by what they can do instead of what's printed on paper actually works. None of that matters if people think it's fraud, so we prove it's not." Natalie grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to hold eye contact. "We document everything, submit to independent audit, provide complete transparency, and we keep working because giving up means everyone who said you couldn't do this and wins." Jake felt something in him crack, the defensive walls he'd built around his fear and shame finally breaching under the weight of her conviction. "You're really willing to fight for this? For me? I love you." The words emerged raw and unplanned. "I love what you've built. I love who you are. I love that you care so much you're willing to destroy yourself to protect other people. But I won't let you give up. Please don't give up." They stood in his office with tears streaming down both their faces, and Jake felt the weight of his fear finally met by something stronger. Natalie's absolute refusal to let him fail. He pulled her into an embrace, felt her arms wrap around him with fierce strength, and made the choice to believe that courage wasn't the absence of terror, but continuing despite it. The next weeks were brutal. Independent auditors examined every foundation transaction. The team provided documentation for every candidate, every placement, every claim of success. The truth emerged slowly. One candidate had held a part-time job when placed, fully disclosed in his application, and critics had exaggerated that single case into widespread fraud. The Wall Street Journal published a retraction, but the damage rippled through their donor base and partner relationships. Jake barely slept, working 18-hour days to prove the foundation's integrity while watching funding evaporate. Natalie stood beside him through all of it, her conviction never wavering. And Jake discovered that love could be as much about refusing to let someone quit as about romantic gesture. The foundation survived, barely. But survival meant facing the financial reality that charitable donations couldn't sustain them long-term. The consulting model needed to become their primary revenue source, which meant training candidates differently, marketing their services to companies, transforming from social program to business venture. We're evolution. Jake told his team during the strategy session that would determine their future. We started as charity approving credentials don't matter. Now we're becoming a talent agency that makes money proving it. That's not selling out. That's sustainability. The transformation took 3 months, but by the foundation's first anniversary, they generated $3.2 million in consulting revenue and projected sustainability within another year. The 89% retention rate, compared to 62% industry average, became their primary marketing tool. Companies stopped seeing the foundation as risky social experiment and started seeing it as competitive advantage. The one-year anniversary event transformed the Long Island City warehouse into celebration space packed with 300 people. Candidates who'd found stable employment mixed with corporate partners and donors and media covering the foundation's improbable success. Jake stood at the edge of the crowd feeling overwhelmed, watching Emma laugh with Maria Santos and Tommy Wu, seeing the human faces behind statistics he recited in interviews. Natalie took the small stage they'd erected, and the room quieted with the particular attention she commanded effortlessly. A year ago, this man broke into my building looking for scrap metal. Her eyes found Jake in the crowd. Today, he's changing how America thinks about hiring. We've placed 67 candidates with 89% retention. We've generated $3.2 million in revenue. We've proven that capability matters more than credentials. She paused, and something in her expression shifted. But more than that, Jake Carson has proven that people society writes off can write better stories than society imagined. That taking risks on unconventional talent isn't charity, it's smart business. That the best experts on systemic failure are those who've survived it. The applause built, but Natalie held up a hand for quiet. There's something else. She gestured for Jake to join her, and he moved through the crowd with stomach churning, having no idea what she was planning. When he reached the stage, Natalie took his hand. A year ago, you made me a promise. You'd open my vault, and I'd give you $100 million. You kept your promise, and so did I. But what I didn't promise was that you'd save my life in ways that had nothing to do with vaults or contracts or money. Jake felt his heart hammering, awareness creeping over him that this was not a normal anniversary speech. You taught me that success without connection is just expensive loneliness. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That the most valuable things can't be bought or controlled or protected through perfect planning. Natalie reached into her pocket and produced a small box, and the room went absolutely silent. Jake Carson, you proved that taking risks on people is always worth it. Will you let me spend my life proving you were worth the risk? Jake stood frozen as Natalie opened the box to reveal a simple platinum band, elegant and understated and perfect. The question hung in the air, and Jake's mind went completely blank except for one overwhelming truth. He wanted this, wanted her, wanted the life they were building together more than he'd wanted anything since Sarah died. Yes. The word came out rough with emotion. Yes, of course, yes. The kiss happened before Jake registered moving, and the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Emma appeared at stage edge, her face lit with joy, and Jake pulled her up to join them. Does this mean Miss Natalie's my mom now? If you want me to be. Natalie knelt to Emma's level, and Jake saw his daughter's expression transform into something like wonder. I want. Emma launched herself at Natalie, and Jake stood watching the two most important people in his life embrace while 300 people celebrated around them. The media coverage shifted overnight. The story stopped being about unconventional hiring practices and became about the billionaire CEO marrying the former homeless veteran in a modern fairy tale. Jake hated the narrative, hated how it reduced their complexity to Disney formula, but Natalie reminded him that attention was currency and they should spend it marketing the foundation. 18 months after the foundation's launch, Jake stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., Natalie beside him, and Omar joining via satellite from Abu Dhabi. Emma sat in the gallery between Jake's mother, recovered enough from dementia to travel, and Omar's wife, a woman whose arranged marriage had evolved into genuine partnership. The statistics Jake recited had the weight of irrefutable evidence. 847 candidates placed across 34 cities, 91% retention rate, average salary increase of 240% for participants, $47 million in annual consulting revenue, making the foundation completely self-sustaining. Senator Patricia Brennan from Ohio leaned forward with the skeptical expression of someone accustomed to identifying government waste. Mr. Carson, you have no formal education in workforce development, no business degree, no traditional qualifications for advising Congress on employment policy. What exactly qualifies you to be here? Jake met her eyes directly, feeling the weight of every person whose story resembled his own. 2 years ago, I was homeless and desperate. Today, I've helped 847 people escape similar situations. My qualification isn't a degree. It's that I lived the problem everyone's trying to solve and found a way through it. Sometimes the best experts are the people who suffered most. The silence following his response felt profound, and Jake saw several senators exchange glances that suggested his answer had landed with unexpected force. Senator Brennan's expression softened slightly. How do we scale this nationally? Natalie leaned forward, her business expertise complementing Jake's lived experience. The same way any successful innovation scales. Prove it works, document the methodology, provide training and resources to replicators. We've already created comprehensive guidelines. What we need is funding to support pilot programs across 50 states and technical assistance to help local organizations adapt our model. The committee voted to approve a $500 million pilot program over 5 years, with the Carson Foundation as primary administrator. Jake sat in the hearing room afterward, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude, by the distance between the man who'd broken into a building looking for scrap metal and the person now managing $500 million in federal funds. Natalie took his hand. You okay? Terrified, grateful, convinced this is still a dream. Jake squeezed her fingers. But yeah, I'm okay. They married 3 weeks later in a Queens courthouse ceremony. Emma as flower girl and Omar as best man, his wife Amira beside him with visible evidence of their first child on the way, and Natalie's parents crying with the complicated joy of seeing their daughter happy, despite their disappointment that she'd chosen someone without proper credentials. The reception happened at the Long Island City warehouse, transformed by white lights and flowers into space that held 200 of the people whose lives intersected with theirs. Jake's mother gave a toast, her words occasionally confused but her love unmistakable. My son is a good man, always has been, even when the world forgot it. This woman saw that. Emma gave her own speech, 8 years old, speaking with confidence that made Jake's chest tighten. My daddy saved Miss Natalie's safe. Miss Natalie saved my daddy. Now we're a family. Maria Santos had been promoted to senior developer and spoke about how the foundation proved that intelligence existed in places society refused to look. Tommy Wu, now running his own consulting firm focused on operational efficiency, talked about learning that corporate jargon was just another language and that translation was possible with the right teachers. But the moment that broke Jake was when Natalie's father approached him privately, speaking careful English with heavy accent. I was wrong about my daughter. I thought she should marry someone with impressive degree, important family connections. She married a man with integrity and courage. That is better. The words carried the weight of admission from someone who'd spent decades believing one truth and was now accepting its revision. Jake shook his father-in-law's hand and felt the gesture complete some circle he hadn't known needed closing. 5 years after opening the vault that changed his life, Jake stood in the rebuilt community center in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood, watching the newest cohort of foundation candidates present their solutions to infrastructure challenges. Emma was 13 now, volunteering at the foundation on weekends and talking about studying engineering like her mom. The twins, David and Omar, named for the men who'd been present at the foundation's beginning, were 2 years old and currently creating chaos in the childcare area Natalie had insisted they establish. The numbers had grown beyond Jake's capacity to fully grasp their magnitude. 6,400 candidates placed across 89 cities in 12 countries. 90% retention rate holding steady, $340 million in annual revenue. The congressional program operating in all 50 states. 7,200 people employed directly or indirectly by the foundation's work. But what mattered more than numbers were the faces. The single mother who designed a water conservation system that was now being implemented nationwide. The former gang member whose logistics optimization saved companies millions. The immigrant whose engineering degree from Nigeria meant nothing to American employers until the foundation gave him projects that proved his capability. Natalie found him at the edge of the crowd, and they stood together watching the presentations. Remember when you were terrified you'd choose the wrong people? Every day. Jake pulled her close, feeling the familiar comfort of her presence. Still am sometimes. That's how you know you're doing it right. If you ever feel completely confident, that's when I'll worry. She smiled up at him. Besides, being terrified and doing it anyway, isn't that what courage actually is? Jake thought back to that morning in the van when he'd woken desperate and focused entirely on survival, unable to imagine any future beyond getting through the next day. The distance between that moment and this one seemed impossible to measure, but he could trace the path, a locked vault, a desperate offer, a decision to trust someone who saw value everyone else missed. Emma appeared with the twins in tow, both boys sticky with something that might have been juice. Daddy, David wants to know if he can push the buttons when we go home. He means the elevator buttons in Natalie's building, a privilege both twins considered the height of luxury. Sure, buddy, Jake knelt to the twins' level. But only if you share with your brother. We take turns, right? Right, the twins responded in unison. And Jake felt the familiar, overwhelming love that parenthood amplified but couldn't contain. They drove back to their house in Queens, the neighborhood where Jake insisted they stay, despite Natalie's ability to afford anywhere, and the evening settled into domestic routine. Dinner as a family, homework supervision for Emma, bedtime negotiations with the twins, finally quiet in the living room with Natalie curled against his side. The vault that started all this sits in Natalie's office still, kept as museum piece with a plaque explaining its significance. Intelligence exists everywhere, the plaque reads. Sometimes you just need the right key to unlock it. Sometimes the key finds you. Photographs line the hallway leading to that office, a visual history of what one desperate morning and one impossible offer created. Jake Carson at 32, dirty and scared, facing down his own obsolescence. Natalie Chen at 34, brilliant and isolated, commanding an empire that couldn't solve the one problem that mattered. Emma at 8, learning that stability was possible. Omar at 35, discovering that partnership could transcend cultural expectations. And now, 5 years later, a family. Not the family Jake had planned with Sarah, but a family nonetheless, built from grief and desperation and the crazy belief that people deserved to be judged by their capability rather than their credentials. Jake Carson fell asleep that night with his wife beside him, his children safe in their beds, and the sure knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and doubts and moments when he questioned whether he was qualified for any of this. But he'd learned something in the years since he'd broken into a building looking for scrap metal. Qualification wasn't about credentials or preparation or some inherent worthiness. It was about showing up when showing up mattered, about solving the problem in front of you with the tools you had, about believing that your experience, however unconventional, could be valuable to someone who needed exactly what you'd survived. The last thought before sleep was of Sarah, hoping she knew somehow that he'd kept going, that Emma was thriving, that he'd found a way to turn the worst moments of his life into something that helped other people avoid similar depths, and hoping she knew he still loved her, would always love her, even while building new love that didn't diminish the old. The morning would bring congressional oversight meetings and foundation expansion plans and the thousand small challenges of managing an organization that had grown far beyond Jake's original vision. But tonight there was just this, warmth and safety, and the quiet certainty that intelligence existed everywhere, waiting only for recognition and opportunity to prove what had always been possible. Word count, 6,849 words.